Greed Island, a video game for NEN users that pits its players against one another in a challenge to collect 100 cards by any means in order to secure a victory and gain a tremendous prize. The Greed Island arc of Hunter x Hunter is perhaps the most ambitious storyline in the series yet, with pretty complicated video game rules created in order to complement the story being told, while still continuing with a rich, character-driven narrative. This arc finds Gon and Killua transported to what they believe is a virtual world created by Gon's elusive father, but what awaits them is a land ravaged by greed, where players struggle to even survive, let alone thrive, due to a terrorist threat. The Greed Island arc of Hunter x Hunter is a thematic tale that focuses on the consequences of human greed, but it explores topics outside of the obvious one in the title. Within Greed Island are also stories of redemption, teamwork, and a commentary on human society reflected in the various gamifications of the world our young hunters progress through. In this video, I'm going to break down the core themes of the Greed Island arc, using the manga and the 2011 anime as my main sources of analysis to get at the heart of what I believe this story is trying to say. I'd like to begin this discussion off by breaking down the titular theme of this arc, greed, and all the different aspects of it we see on display, as I believe that will help contextualize the story and serve as a base to better understand the overall message. The Merriam-Webster definition of greed is a selfish and excessive desire for more of something, such as money, than is needed. Seems simple enough to understand. However, in the story of Greed Island, I believe we see three different types of greed: violent greed, selfless greed, and power greed. These three types help to round out the message that Greed Island is trying to get across with all the players involved, because while greed creeps into every aspect of this story, not everyone wants the same thing, and I think the motivation behind their greed is what separates these three categories. Before I get any further though, I think it would be important to take a closer look at what exactly Greed Island is, so we can keep that information in the back of our minds throughout the events I'm going to discuss. We find out that Greed Island was created by Gon's father Ging, and a mix of NEN users and hunters whose initials all make up the acronym Greed Island. So in theory, if Ging worked with a completely different group of people, then this game would have a much different name. Although, the argument could be made that Ging wanted the name Greed Island, since it does really seem to fit the concept of the game itself, and he forcefully removes the first W from Dune's name in order to make everything fit with the established title, but that's besides the point. The game was created for hunters and originally cost 5.8 billion Jenny, with only 100 copies in circulation. Although the timeline is tricky to nail down, it seems the game went on sale around the time that Gon was born, which coincides with the theory that Ging both brought Gon to Greed Island when he was a baby, and that Greed Island was created, at least in part, for Gon's benefit. Either to train him, to impart life lessons to him, or just to entertain him, the reason isn't exactly clear. The goal of the game is to collect 100 specified slot cards which have a limited supply and can be gathered by either progressing through the quest or through interaction with other players, such as trading or stealing. If someone wins the game, they are allowed to bring 3 of these specified slot cards into the real world. There are a number of other unspecified slot cards, such as spells and other random nonsense, that are important to gameplay, but for the purposes of this video, I think we've highlighted the relevant bits. The most important aspect of this game for the message of the story is the competition to collect scarce resources and how that drive influences the behavior of the players. So let's get back into the greed. Before, I mentioned 3 types of greed, and I want to flesh out those concepts a bit more and explain why I think there is an important distinction between each of them that both informs us of the characters as well as builds the overall theme. Violent greed is the first kind of greed that we are directly introduced to in the form of the bomber. Very soon after arriving at Greed Island, Gon and Killua witness a murder in town which was caused by a secretive terrorist who kills players to steal their cards. They are then approached by a massive alliance who want to unite in an unviolent resistance to the bomber, but Gon grows frustrated with them and walks away. This was an interesting beat for the usually friendly Gon, who didn't appreciate that the alliance was blaming the game his father made for the actions of individuals that abused the rules. In Gon's mind, because the game itself doesn't stipulate that players must kill in order to get cards, the fact that some players choose to do so is not the game's fault, which is interesting when looking at the game of Greed Island as a microcosm of the real world. Would you blame the actions of a greedy murderer solely on the environment he is in, or does the murderer not bear a brunt of the blame himself? It's an interesting question, but one that Gon already has his answer to. This violent greed is the main driver of the narrative progression as the bombers, Genthru and his two companions, become the main antagonists of the arc, killing and endangering nearly every player on Greed Island. However, in the end, Greed Island itself punishes those who would exert their violent desires over the other players. The final test for the last specified slot card that ends up winning Gon the game is a test that rewards a deep knowledge of the minutiae of the game that can only be learned by playing it the way it was intended. We don't see the bombers participate in this quiz, but we can assume that since their strategy was to kill and steal, they wouldn't have the in-depth knowledge on how to acquire all the slot cards that someone like Gon, who never stole a card, had gained through his playstyle. While this type of greed, a greed driven by the desire for wealth and reward at any price, is ultimately the most condemned by the story, interestingly enough, we do see that the character of Genthru isn't irredeemable, which connects to two separate themes I'll discuss later on. But now, let's continue onto the next type of greed. Selfless greed may seem like an oxymoron, so let me explain the reason I chose that name. This type of greed is most exemplified by the character of Mr. Batera, the billionaire who hired most of the current Greed Island players in order to beat the game for him with the offer of a reward. While Batera's massive reward money is fueling the greed of the competitors and is the driving force behind the violent greed of the bombers, he is not acting for himself, but for someone he cares about. This is something that isn't revealed until the final conflict of the arc is set in motion, so for the majority of the time we know of Mr. Batera, we just assume him to be a typical greedy billionaire after even greater fortune to continue to make himself disgustingly wealthy. However, he's actually burning through that wealth, trying to acquire every copy of Greed Island that he can, and offering outrageous rewards to attract the most skilled hunters he can find in order to save the life of his comatose fiancée. His goal is to acquire the Angel's Breath card, which can heal all mortal wounds and diseases from Greed Island, so that he can use it to heal the love of his life. This is something that did not need to be added to the story, as it really has no direct impact on any of the main characters involved, nor does it influence the final conflict, but Togashi still felt it was something that belonged, and I think it adds an interesting angle to the story. It shows us that not all greed is necessarily bad, it can even be virtuous, and this brings me to the final type of greed I'd like to discuss. Power greed is about as straightforward as it sounds, the desire for more power, and this is the type of greed that Gon embodies throughout the entire arc. At first you may be wondering why I'm singling Gon out specifically, since during this arc both he and Killua are training to get stronger and more powerful with their nen abilities, but this power greed goes beyond training to better oneself. Although, there is someone else in this arc who is a good example of this power greed in action. You guessed it, Hisoka. And interestingly enough, there's also someone who serves as the antithesis to this power greed, the one-star hunter Tisgara. So while this kind of greed isn't blatantly on display throughout the entire arc, it really comes to the forefront of the storytelling in the back half and is the most explored by the narrative. This power greed is the overwhelming desire for more power, but unlike in the case of violent greed, power greed isn't necessarily about doing harm to others for your own benefit, and unlike selfless greed, power greed is entirely about serving the self and enhancing one's pride in their own abilities. This goes beyond the idea of training, because this power greed goes beyond the normal motivations of a person simply trying to better themselves, and is instead more of an obsession without care for any consequences to prove to oneself their own power or worth. Hisoka is perhaps the easiest person to explain, since he has a singular mission in this arc. Hisoka is on Greed Island in order to find the Nen Exorcist for Chrollo. He wants to remove Kurapika's Nen contract on Chrollo for the sole purpose of then battling him. Hisoka literally has nothing more that he wants to do in this world than just wait around, bored out of his mind for months and bathing in swamps on a desolate island, all because he has an insatiable desire to prove his power against Chrollo in a fight. That is power greed. And in the meantime, if he can compete in a volleyball game with some young, strong boys by his side, that'll be a good enough distraction. The volleyball game with Razor is where I want to focus on Gon's power greed and also discuss Tizgara's complete lack of it. Up to this point in the story, Gon and Killua haven't had much to do other than train with Biscuit in order to get stronger. The trio actually don't really get involved with the collection of cards until fairly deep into this story, so the volleyball game with Razor was the first real personal challenge Gon has been faced with in some time. Although it isn't a real fight, this is the first real narrative battle outside of training that Gon has participated in since his battle with Hisoka at Heaven's Arena, and back then, he was also acting a little bloodlusty, and I believe how he acts throughout the rest of this arc is an extension of that behavior. In the volleyball match with Razor, Gon states that a cheap win is not good enough, and that he wants to beat Razor based on sheer force of power. There is no occasion in which Gon tries to dodge Razor's incredibly powerful throws. Instead, each time, he attempts to block or catch the ball. The first time, this leads to him being knocked out of play with a fairly serious head wound, and yet, right away, he is eager to jump back in and try it again. Killua and Hisoka strategize that simply dodging Razor's attacks and catching his devil's throws would be a simpler way to win, but Gon retorts that wouldn't be a true victory. He says that he has to crush Razor completely, and then goes to fire off his John Ken Rock ball launch. With each of these attacks for the rest of the match, Gon claims that he needs even more power and digs deep to increase his Ren. Gon is even willing to go so far as to seriously damage Killua's hands in the process of these exertions of his power, which, given he has a sweet enough reason for, is also an example of how much firing off these powerful attacks against Razor means to him, even when he has been presented with a couple of different options for victory at this point in the match. Before Razor launches his last spike, he absorbs all his Nen Devils back into himself, rejoining their power to his. Hisoka says that now we will see Razor at max power, and all Gon does is smirk. Gon isn't entirely brain dead and power horny in this match though. He's smart enough to know that he cannot stop one of Razor's throws on his own, and uses the trio of remaining contestants to form a power stance, much to Hisoka's delight, that can stop even Razor's spike. After firing off his last attack, Gon is exhausted and passes out right before Razor's deflection can hit him, which is the best thing that could have happened to Gon in this scenario. Even Razor has seen enough over this match to know that Gon would not be willing to dodge. He wants to pit power against power. If Gon had the strength to stand, I think his power greed would have gotten him killed right then and there. Luckily for Gon, Hisoka shares his power greed and will only accept a flawless victory. He fires the deflection back at Razor with his bungee gum and sticks it to Razor's arms so that Team Gon is victorious. A simple volleyball game became a match of arrogant power versus arrogant power. A glorified pissing match if you want to look at it that way, or a battle of pride led by two exceptional warriors unwilling to give an inch to the other. Before I get to the final example of Gon's power greed in this arc, I want to take a second to look at the character of Tizgara. Tizgara begins the arc looking down on Gon and Killua's power, and by the next time they meet him, toward the end of the arc, he is utterly cucked by how quickly they've grown, visibly surpassing him in raw power repeatedly right away. The reason that I stated that Tizgara is the antithesis to the power greed Gon displays isn't because he's weaker than the boys. Power greed has nothing to do with actual power, it is a mindset, and one that Tizgara admits to having developed the opposite of. At first, Tizgara is presented to the audience and the other characters of this world as a really big deal, a legendary one-star hunter. However, when Tizgara is knocked out of the volleyball game, he reflects on his abilities compared to Gon and Killua. He says that this is what he gets for being overly cautious and only choosing to fight battles that he knows he can win. This is the complete opposite of power greed, wherein Tizgara has fallen into a slump of contentment with his own power, so much so that even his basic instincts have dulled to the point that his years of experience over the young hunters have been rendered meaningless in battle. Gon and Tizgara are on opposite ends of a spectrum of desire for power, but in witnessing Gon and Killua's power on display during this match, Tizgara is inspired to begin his training again from scratch. The sheer force of Gon's power greed ignites something in Tizgara's soul. Thus, through Tizgara, we are shown that although Gon's power greed has self-destructive tendencies, it also has great benefits and cannot be viewed as a net negative mental state. And this brings me to Gon's final display of power greed in this arc, which so happens to be the greatest example of just how self-destructive this mental state can be when pushed to the absolute limit. The final battle with our trio of hunters versus the bombers goes fairly well for both Biscuit and Killua, who followed their strategy seamlessly. Gon, on the other hand, get it? If not, give it a sec. Decides that he's gonna hold off on following his part of the plan until he's good and satisfied. The plan is for Gon to reel in Genthru by appearing to be weaker than he is, so that Genthru will lower his guard and Gon can unleash his trap. But Gon, with ever the desire to prove his power against others, claims that he can't stand being on the losing side forever and is gonna force Genthru to use his ability against him. Only then will Gon go through with the plan. This is perhaps the most greedy and selfish that Gon has ever been. He is willing to sacrifice the well-laid plan of his friends and their victory, also that he can test his power against Genthru's. While Gon does give Genthru a run for his money, ultimately, he ends up getting one of his hands blown off and the other arm severely damaged, also that he can get one solid kick in on Genthru's face. After this, Gon decides to finally follow through with the plan and easily defeats Genthru, but his power greed nearly cost him his life and potentially even the lives of Biscuit and Killua had Genthru succeeded in killing Gon. These three different types of greed on display in Greed Island are important for understanding the main players involved in the action and what motivates the decisions they make. Violent greed, selfless greed, and power greed are not the only types of greed presented within the story, but I believe they are the ones with the greatest thematic impact that is relevant to the larger message of this arc. Through these types of greed, we are shown the consequences of excessive desire. The violent greed of the bombers slaughters dozens of people for ultimately no reason, as they are defeated and likely wouldn't have been able to pass the final test to earn the last card due to this greed. The selfless greed of Patera, while well-intentioned, is still ultimately self-serving, and unfortunately, he still fails in his quest to save his love, while his desire fuels the greed of others and directly causes their deaths in the process. The power greed of Gon ultimately does not aid him, as his victories both come from examples of not allowing his power greed to control him. He beats Razor because he faints, and he beats Genthru because he finally gets his greed under control. Greed Island is a condemnation of greed, showcasing example after example of the consequences of allowing desire to run rampant in your mind. I believe this is the larger message that Gene was trying to impose on Gon through this aptly named game, but there are other subtle lessons that this game imparts on those who play it. The other two lessons that I'd like to focus on for the remainder of this video each have some direct connection to Gene, which is why I believe they're important to analyze. The first lesson is that of redemption. We actually see multiple examples of redemption on display in this arc from several characters, most obviously Razor, and the serial killer Benolt. Let me start with Benolt since you may have no clue who I'm even talking about. Benolt is the creepy scissor guy that Biscuit makes Gon and Killua train against in the Wasteland. He's only featured within 3 chapters, but his character does have a redemption arc that, again, wasn't necessary to the overall narrative and has no impact on any of the main characters, but I think he highlights something important to this story. Benolt is introduced as a cannibal serial killer with a specific taste for the flesh of 22-year-old women, and during his forced training with the boys, we see a flashback to his childhood, seemingly growing up in poverty. A young Benolt approaches a wealthy couple to return a wallet that they dropped, and he is beaten bloody and left in the dirt. Benolt reflects that he didn't want a reward or even a word of thanks. He just wanted to live as a decent human being. Benolt begs Gon to kill him, but instead, Gon thanks Benolt for his help, and Benolt then says he's going to turn himself in for his crimes. This may seem extremely random within the story, but later on, we actually see that Razor himself had a similar backstory to that of Benolt. Razor was a death row convict before he met Gene, who gave him a second chance at life, and we see that Razor was also abused as a child. There are only 2 small panels of Razor's backstory, but in one, he has been hit in the face by some kind of weapon, with a man standing over him, shouting that Razor owes him his life. Razor says that Gene taught him that if just one person in the whole world believes in you, you can be redeemed. That is the significance of Gon's interaction with Benoit. It was an echo of Jin's interaction with Razor. The father and son both treated people beyond reproach with kindness, and that kindness ultimately led to penance and redemption. I think it's also interesting to note that both Razor and Benoit were abused by people who seemed greedy. Both of their abuses were in a context of currency, with Benoit being attacked for returning a wallet to a wealthy couple, and Razor's life being claimed as the property of someone else. Just another couple examples of the consequences of greed thrown in for good measure. These acts of redemption also tie into the character of Killua, who Gon expressly states to believe in at the volleyball match with Razor, and whose past as a murderer is touched on at the end of the story, and also with Genthru. There are a number of times in this arc that we see Genthru acting in a kind way with his companions, such as when he rolls the risky dice himself, showing that he isn't the standard villainous leader who treats his henchmen like crap. Then, at the very end, we see that the bombers all care deeply for one another. Genthru makes sure his friend, who is nearly beaten to death by Biscuit, is healed with Angel's Breath, and then, when there is seemingly only one Angel's Breath card left, the other bomber requests that it be used on Genthru. If Razor's statement about redemption is one of the messages of this arc, then because the bombers believe in each other, and because Gon, Biscuit, and Killua are willing to show them mercy, then even the main villains of this arc can be redeemed. Speaking of the end of this arc, this brings me to the last message that I want to tackle, and it's something that I find a little difficult to break down. I can't tell if Togashi is playing 3D chess with this message, or if I'm looking way too much into it, or if things are just a bit sloppy, but either way, I'm going to try and make a concise point. Teamwork is a big deal in Greed Island, and we see various implementations of teams in action. Right away, we are introduced to an alliance. The endgame battle comes down to a conflict between 3 different teams trying to outmaneuver the other, and a massive mission within this arc requires a team of 15 to be assembled just in order to activate it, which then comes down to an 8-man team match of volleyball. In that last example, teamwork is literally built into the fabric of the game. Then, at the very end, Gon even tells Dune that he couldn't have won the game alone, he needed his friends. So keep in mind that everything in Greed Island was crafted by Jean, but when Gon chooses to travel with his friend, with his teammate, to meet Jean at the very end of the arc, he is punished for that decision. Why? Was he really punished, or is something more going on? Jean literally rigs the game, breaking his own rules depending on what card Gon used in an attempt to meet him. If Gon used Magnetic Force, a spell card that only transports one person, Jean would have allowed Gon to fly to him, but he sets it up that if Gon instead used Accompany, a spell card that can transport multiple people, Gon would be taken to Kite. In the flashback, Jean states that he could meet Gon if he's on his own, but if he's a wimp who has to be with his friends all the time, he doesn't want to meet him. He is questioned on why Gon would be a wimp if he has friends, and called out as being a self-conscious, shy sourpuss, and I have to agree. I don't think that Jean is telling the truth when he explains why he rigs the game the way he does. Now, this is just pure speculation, but everything we know about Jean, and the fact that he built the whole game of Greed Island, at least in part to train Gon, makes it difficult to believe that Jean would really think Gon is a wimp for having friends, since the only way to beat the game is with teamwork. I actually don't think that this rigging of the game is punishing Gon at all, even though that's what it seems at first. I think that by rigging the game in this way, Jean is really testing to see what kind of personality his son has. Jean doesn't know Gon at all, and it seems to me that instead of a punishment, this rigging is meant to send Gon to the person that's best for him. If Gon was a stoic loner, then he would probably be happy enough meeting Jean, since Jean is a self-described, not nice guy. But if Gon wanted to travel with a friend, that says something completely different about his personality, and perhaps Jean felt that Kite would be the right person for a friendly Gon to meet. I don't think we'll ever get a clear answer on why Jean set things up the way that he did, but it's clear to me that the final message of the Greed Island arc is about the value of teamwork, something that Jean himself seems to struggle with, but a lesson he knows is important, and that's why he wanted to impart it onto his own son, so that he could become a better man than he is. The Greed Island arc of Hunter x Hunter is all about the life lessons an absent father wanted to impart to his son. The bulk of the message that comes from the Greed Island arc focuses on the various aspects of greed and highlights how greed, in all of its forms, even if it's for the best of intentions, ultimately leads to unsatisfying outcomes. We are also shown the value in believing in people, even those who most would feel don't deserve a second chance, because even the most horrid of humanity has the capacity to be redeemed. And the arc ends with what I believe is a roundabout show of support for the importance of teamwork from Gon's elusive father, reinforcing to his son that not everything can be accomplished on your own. The title of the game, an acronym of the team of people Ging assembled to help him create it, is the perfect example of that. And now we've come to the end of this video. Greed Island was an arc I didn't really appreciate my first time around, but upon a second watch through and first read through in the manga, I actually came to enjoy it a lot more. I mean, the sheer insanity of Togashi creating all of these game rules has to be respected, and at one point in my read through, he just randomly created a board game between chapters. The dude is a nut, and I can't help but respect his intelligence, which is why I enjoy making these thematic breakdowns so much. I may not always get everything right, I've obviously never talked to the guy, so my interpretations are just those of an interested fan, but I'm curious what you think about my breakdown. Do you agree with my points, or do you think there are some things I got wrong or totally missed? Please let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, sharing it with someone else you think would enjoy it too would be greatly appreciated. My next Hunter x Hunter video is going to be a big one. I'm going to finally tackle the Chimera Ants arc, and I already know I'm going to have a ton to say. That'll be releasing before the end of the year, so if you're interested in that, subscribing is the best way to be notified when it releases. I want to thank you all so much for making it this far. I really appreciate you absolute kooks, and I hope to see you in the next video, but until then, I'll shut up.